Hey everyone, it's Advent season here in OiC, and we're taking the time to talk about and reflect about how the Christmas story, the gospel story, is a story for all people. That's what we hear the angel tell the shepherds in the gospel according to St. Luke. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all people. And we ask, who might all people be? And what does it mean that this story is not only to be told to all people, but that it is good news to all people? My name is Michael, and I'm the pastor at Oslo International Church, and I'm exploring these questions with you throughout this Advent season. And the way we are exploring them is by looking at how Scripture tells us this story, the Christmas story, how it tells us differently in its different writings, in its different authors and context. Especially, we are looking at how the four gospel accounts of St. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John tell this story. We started last week with St. Mark, and you can find that video on our YouTube channel and our Instagram account. And while you're there, you can also subscribe and follow so that you don't miss out on what's coming next. So we started with St. Mark because he tells the story in a very different way from what we are accustomed to listen at Christmas time. He doesn't tell us about baby Jesus, but he does tell us about the coming of this good news that is for all people, the coming of the Son of God who shares the divine being of the Father, yet walks the dusty roads of Galilee. It seems that there are very different ways for telling this story. And I wanted to share with you just a glimpse of how the kids in OiC chose to tell the story a couple of years ago in our 2018 Advent celebration. So let's take a look at that. It's a pity I can't show you the whole video here because it was so nice. This was definitely a different way of telling the story. The older kids were singing, right? They were singing a song that Trina, an awesome musician in OiC, wrote for this occasion, wrote for them. And she made the song in Norwegian and English, which makes a lot of sense for many of these kids. And the chorus of the song, which you just heard, it went, Hurra, hurra, Jesus kom for å fikse. Hurra, hurra, og fikse verden. Hooray, hooray, Jesus came to fix. Hooray, hooray, to fix the world. And as they sang, the younger kids came along the aisle of the church bringing these huge puzzle pieces. And it was pieces of the world. So when they finished the puzzle, we had this huge shining globe in the front of the church. And then the youngest of the kids, the very small ones, they came in carried by their parents, and they're dressed like stars. And they have these little lights shining on their star costumes, and they're dancing around this globe. I love how the telling of the story and the being part of the story spoke in a way that the kids could relate to. And also, I really liked how it struck a very difficult but very important balance. There was an acknowledgement that there is brokenness. But the whole thing was filled with hope and with expectation and beauty and celebration. Good news. Jesus came and he's putting the pieces together, somehow making sense and beauty of all of this brokenness. But here's the really existential question that I found myself asking when I saw the video again this week. The kids were singing about fixing the world. But what was going on with the puzzle pieces is that the world was actually coming into being. There wasn't anything there to begin with, and at the end of the song, the world was there. So what was this? What was happening? Was this redemption or was it creation? What was going on? It turns out that my favorite gospel writer, St. John, if he saw this, he might very well smile knowingly because he knows what they're talking about. I want to read with you from the Gospel according to John, in the very beginning of chapter 1. It says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified concerning him. He cried out, saying, "This is the one I spoke about when I said, 'He who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me.' Out of his fullness we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known." St. Mark made us reflect on the implications of the Christmas story by placing it at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, not at his birth. John takes the story not just to a different time in the earthly life of Jesus, but to an altogether different time in history. In fact, he brings it before history. In the beginning was the Word. By beginning his account of the gospel with these words, "in the beginning," John is immediately transporting us back to the account of creation in the very first chapter of the Bible. In the beginning was the Word. In the beginning, God created. The connections between the beginning of the gospel according to John and the beginning of the book of Genesis, they're all too many and too explicit to be confused for anything else than intentional. In the creation account of Genesis, we have God creating in the beginning. God creates from a void of darkness. And the first thing that God does is to speak light into the world. He then goes on in creating until he finally creates humankind, male and female, in his own image and likeness. And the way that God creates is God speaks. God speaks into being. God expresses from his own being in such a way that words form and the beingness of everything else comes into existence. As God reveals himself, creation is revealed into existence. In the beginning was the Word. John says as he starts the gospel account of Jesus. The Word that is the revelation and expression of God, the Word that spoke everything into being. That Word is now wonderfully made flesh and made his dwelling among us. And then John the writer has these interjections concerning John the Baptist to make sure that we know that he is indeed talking about Jesus. Jesus as the Word with the Father in the beginning, an inherent part of the creation expression. Jesus, the light of the world, just as light came first in creation and allowed everything else not only to be created, but to be perceived. Light in the darkness. Jesus, the light, the life through whom we may be children of God. Jesus, the same breath that gave life to humankind created in the image of God. With his introduction to the good news of Jesus Christ, St. John invites us to understand redemption and creation as parts of a whole. And he isn't indicating historical parts, as if one thing was the first half of history and the other the second half. No, he means that they are intrinsically connected and woven into each other like lines in a Celtic knot that fold over each other so that they are perceived as multiple without ever ceasing to be one. In fact, John continues to weave creation and redemption in his account of the gospel, playing with the notion of renewal and restoration. As he moves on in the story in these first chapters of the gospel, Jesus' first miracle is to transform water into wine. His first meeting with the temple in Jerusalem is of clearing it up of its idolatrous clutter, restoring the calling of the courts to welcome people to worship, and simultaneously creating space for the new. He then talks with Nicodemus, and he talks with Nicodemus about being born again. He talks to a Samaritan woman by a well about flowing waters of life that could flow in her. He heals a crippled man by a pool. He feeds a hungry multitude with a few loaves of bread. He walks on water. He talks of himself as bread of life. As Jesus walks the roads, the cities, and the countrysides, there is a sense of the presence of the one who is Lord over creation. But there is also a sense of newness. There is a sense of the profound dignity and mark of God in the created order walking alongside a transformative power of redemption. Creation and redemption, restoration and renewal happen by the same breath of the power and will of a God who wishes to reveal himself and whose revelation carries in both creation and redemption the mark of grace. As the children in OiC, they enacted this double act of creation and redemption renewal in telling, and as they do this, in telling the story of the coming of Christ, the story of Christmas. They were, probably unknowingly, but they were expressing this profound and mystical poetry of the Gospel of John. But we are called not only to contemplate and meditate on this profound mystery, not only to listen as the praises of God comes from the mouths of little children. No, we are called also to live in it, to live into this story, So I want to suggest 3 implications from this reading of Christmas that places Christ both in the manger and before the dawn of time. The first implication of this temporal displacement of John's Christmas is that it tells us that Jesus is not an afterthought. In fact, grace and redemption are not an afterthought. Jesus is not something that God comes up with when things went wrong in creation. Grace is not something that God came up with because we were too flimsy to survive without. John places Jesus and grace before the beginning of time. And so he reveals them to be of the very nature of God, from the beginning and beyond the end. And this surely gives us all sorts of theological and philosophical questions to deal with, but it also tells us something wonderful about God. God is love. God's grace is not a sparingly used tool, but the deepest expression of His goodness and His godness. And that is good news. The second implication is that creation and revelation are deeply connected. Not just creation and redemption, but creation and revelation are deeply connected. The Word was in the beginning. Creation happens as God speaks. And so also gospel revelation, right? The good news of Christ, it isn't simply revealing something, it is creating something new as it is revealed. The gospel is both redemption in us and creation in us. We are born again, as Jesus tells Nicodemus. We are a new creation, as Paul puts it. And Jesus is the name who speaks this double act into being. And this leads me to my third point, the third implication, which is when I finally get practical. All of this means that we can be both restored, renewed, and become something new, a new creation. And this means that as followers of Jesus and witnesses to the creating and redeeming Word of God, we can act for both restoration and renewal. For both restoration and the something new. What does this mean? Well, it means that we can hope for the new heavens and the new earth at the same time as we work tirelessly for the good and the restoration of the very earth our feet step on right now. This means that we can call Jesus the bread of life and also give bread to the hungry. This means that we can declare that only the justice of God is enough and still fight tirelessly for justice and fight for more just systems. This means that caring for creation, that caring about climate change and caring about cleaning the oceans and protecting wildlife from humanity's greed, that is perfectly coherent with crying that Jesus may come again and restore all things and make all things new. This means that to say that the gospel is for all people, yet not treat all people as equally worthy, equally wonderfully and fearfully made, that is hypocrisy and is not in keeping with the good news of Jesus Christ. It means that the gospel, that the Christmas story, that the coming of the Christ for us and in us is hope for our eyes and the yearning of our souls, and it is strength for our hands and for our hearts. It means that Christmas is a call for a living service in the power of Christ, who was, who is, and who is to come. So may the Lord bless us and bless you. May He keep you. May He make His face shine with His light upon you and be gracious to you. And may He turn His face towards you and speak peace into your life and into this world. Let us go in this peace and serve the Lord joyfully.